Welcome to the first episode of Refactoring with Bob. I am your host and guy who thinks he knows everything, Bob. Let's get started. So for today's scenario, we're looking at basically a comment approval system. We're specifically looking at the function that approves the comment. So just imagine that there's some kind of administrative interface where either a site administrator or maybe the owner of a blog is looking at a queue of comments that are being held for moderation. They click a button of some kind and it calls a function that approves the comment. We're going to look at that function today. And what that function really does is it validates a few things, then adds the comment to the page, and then publishes the page. So the code we're going to be looking at today is not real code. This is just stuff I mocked up, but it is based off of real issues and patterns I see in real code. So let's dive in. So typically the first thing I like to do before I do anything else is try to understand exactly what the code is doing. So in this case, we've got a constructor that accepts a CMS API argument, and that gets saved as a private field. Okay, that's fine. I'm assuming that this is getting injected by some kind of inversion of control or dependency injection, whatever you want to call it. And that's fine. I just want to make a note of that in case I need any other dependencies. I'll just inject them in the constructor. I try to keep it consistent based on what's already being done unless I have a specific reason to not do that. So this is the method that we're actually going to take a look at. Right off the bat, I see it's called doComment, which is just not an acceptable function name. doComment doesn't mean anything. Anytime you have the word do, chances are you're going down the wrong direction. So, in theory, you could call it comment, but that's not really helpful either because that's not really what this is doing. What this is doing is publishing a comment, but we'll come back to that. Here we have a big old bunch of stuff here, checking some stuff. We'll dig into that in a sec. And it looks like there's several different paths that this can take. It looks like it's returning a status of some kind, and then there's some potentially dead code here returning null. I guess there's no, the compiler isn't telling me that this is unreachable, and it's not because this is an else if, but so it is reachable potentially, but it really depends on how these conditions work out. So let's take a look at what this is doing. So again, first off, one minor note. I'm going to mark this field read-only because this is just a dependency that's being injected. I should never change this value, so I'm just going to be explicit about that and say, hey, this is read-only. This also just reminds me that this is a dependency that I'm just using. I'm not setting or changing, so we'll do that. Let's take a look at this. So if the start publish date has a value and that value is in the past, so the page has already started being published, is already published, and the stop date does not have a value, or the stop date is in the future, so it hasn't stopped being published yet. So basically what we're saying is this page currently published? Rather than just like every time I see this code having to parse that out and understand it, I'm going to take this chunk of code out and name it so that in the future I can just look at that and understand what I'm doing. So this reads a whole lot better. If the page is currently published. Now, looking beyond this, I'm going to come back to this admin users, but if I'm looking beyond this, I see start page has value, blah, blah, blah. This is the exact same logic. And so I'm going to strip that out and drop in is page currently published. Now I've removed some duplicated logic. It reads better, and we can do this some more. Now here I've got basically this same thing, but it looks like it's inverted. So if start page does not have a value, whereas up here it does have a value, the and or the or is an and up here, so the and becomes an or. And then if the start publish date is in the future compared to in the past or currently, So the more I look at this, the more it's clear that this is just a complete inversion of this logic up here. So instead of does not have a stop value, this one does have a stop value, and the stop value is in the past versus or the stop value is in the future. So this whole thing is just like a needless complication when really it could just be if the page is not currently published. Obviously, it also reads a lot better. Else, if the page is not currently published, then we say page is not published. Let's take a look at this. Admin users. Admin users.any, where the user ID of whatever, this must be a list of admin users, equals user ID. User, I believe, is the currently logged in user. So basically, this is saying, is the currently logged in user an admin? As I look at this, I look down here, I actually call this again. This exact logic is called again, only this time it's inverted. I don't think we need to call admin users twice because I don't know what admin user is actually doing. That might be an expensive call. It's a getter, so it shouldn't be, but I don't trust this code. So let's cache that as a value instead. Is current user an admin? Okay, so if the page is currently published and the current user is an admin, we add the comment, we publish the page, return OK. Cool. Let's look at, we notice this duplicate down here. Let's remove that. So now we've kind of removed some more duplicate code. Let's take a look at this one, page owner. So if the page owner is not equal to null, so the page has an owner, and the page owner ID is the current user. Okay, so instead of is admin, it's current user admin, really this is page owned by current user. You're starting to see a pattern here where I'm just taking these chunks of logic that you kind of have to parse out and mentally figure out what it's doing, and I'm giving them variable names so that I can refer to them, and it just makes it much more clear. So now this line now is if the page is currently published and the page is owned by the current user, well then that user has access to publish the page, and so we add the comment to the page and then we publish. I'm guessing the reason we did this in two different branches is because there's an admin publish and a publish owned page method. I don't know what the difference between these calls are, but I'm going to assume that it's important, and so I'm going to keep that. If I come down here and I look if page owner equals null or page owner, so again, this is a complete inversion of this logic. So what I can do is instead of calling this logic and inverting, and I can just refer to the value that we've already figured out. So if the current user is not an admin and they don't own the page, then the user does not have access. Okay, so already I think this is a significant improvement. This is much more readable. A couple things I've noticed. I've got if it is currently published, if it is currently published, if it is not currently published. I feel like we can restructure this a bit because I don't need to check this twice. Basically, if the page is not currently published, I don't need to do anything. So I'm going to pull that out and drop it in up here. If the current page is not currently published, we just return that, and then we don't have to do this other logic. Now there is an argument to be made that a method should only have one exit point. This one already had several, but I think the whole, your method should only have one exit point is much more useful in unmanaged language where you have to clean up resources and stuff. In this case, we're doing C#. C# is a managed language, and so it doesn't matter. If I exit here, C# is going to be smart and clean up any variables that are in the heap for me anyways. So I'm not worried about it. I actually like having early exits. I think it kind of flattens the thing out. You don't have so many nested if statements, and that's just my personal preference. I think it's really up to you and your team to decide how you want to do it. But for me, early exits are great. Okay. So now I don't need this check anymore because I'm actually checking it up here. And if it's not currently published, then none of this code can run. So I'm going to strip this out. All right. So if it's an admin, we run this. If it's the current user's page, then we run this. Otherwise, if it's neither of those cases, return user does not have access. So let's think about this logically. If this one is true, it does this and bails out. If this one is true, it does this and bails out. At this point, we already know that this is false and that this is false. We don't even need to check this. We can easily just make this an else. Now the compiler recognizes that this null is never accessible. It's not reachable. So what I'm going to do instead is just, I'm going to strip that out, and I don't need an else statement. I'm just going to, because of these return statements, I don't actually need to have an else. I'm just going to put that there. So I've noticed I do have some minor duplicated logic here. You know, in both of these branches, we add a comment and we return OK. This is probably not a big deal. If I were code reviewing this, I would be totally fine with this. But again, my personal preference is to bail out early. And so I'm actually going to do a checkup here to see if the user does not have access. So, you know, so if they're not currently an admin, or, you know, they don't own the page, I'm going to bail out at this point. So now what I can do, in both of these branches, we add a comment. In both of these branches, we return OK. So at this point, I know that they either are an admin user or the page is currently owned by the user, so I can actually take out this else if. And so I've simplified this down to just basically two branches. If they have access, we just add the comment. And then depending on the user, we either use the admin publish or we publish the own page, and then we return OK. So one thing I wanted to look at, I'd mentioned I don't know what admin users does, and I hope that it doesn't do any work. I hope that as a getter, it shouldn't be doing a lot of work. But when I look at this, it's actually calling an API on the CMS API object. I don't know if that's cached or what that's doing, but I don't want to make assumptions. If this is a method, there's a good chance that it's actually calling the database. And so this probably shouldn't be a getter, because a getter implies that I'm not going to any third-party resources. I'm not doing any hard calculations or anything. Basically, I should be able to call a getter repeatedly and it not be an issue. But in this case, if get user IDs by type, and then calling get all users, if these things are hitting the database, this getter could be potentially pretty slow. And remember, originally we were calling it twice. Now up here we've sort of refactored it so we only call it once. But I don't think this should be a getter. Now because this is private to the class, I don't have to worry about backwards compatibility. It's not a public API, so I am free to just make this change. I am going to make that change. And then I'm going to call this get admin users. And so now it's more clear up top here that I'm actually like doing some work. I'm getting data from the database and then I'm filtering it. So I think that will work better. Finally, I want to take a look at sort of the whole shape of the function. So this function is called doComment. It accepts a user, but it's not super clear what the user is, and then a comment in the page, which I think is fairly clear. But user to me could mean like, is it the person making the comment? Is it the person who, you know, owns the page? Is it currently logged in user? I don't think it's very clear. But this method is public. Now, generally, when we work with CMS projects, even though the method itself is public, it's not like a public API that third parties are tying into, but just for the sake of doing it, I'm going to pretend that this is a public API and we can't just change this. So what we probably should do, first of all, is we need to obsolete it. And I'll come back with a message in a second. But I just want to make sure that anyone who's still calling this method knows that they shouldn't call it anymore. Then I'm going to make a new method based off the old one that does the work I want it to do, but in a more sensible way. And I'm going to move all of this code out of here and into this one. And now this old method is going to call my new method, but do something sensible, you know, with it. So let's fix the things I don't like about this method. First, the name is terrible. Let's call this add comment and publish page. That's really what it's doing. You could arguably call it approve comment, something like that. Also, user is super vague. I'm going to call this current user. We'll assume that in our user database, or in our practice, current user is basically lingo for currently logged in user. My assumption is everyone on my team is going to know what current user means. If you have different verbiage that you use, try to stick to something that the team will recognize. The other thing I don't like about this is that it's returning statuses as strings. So if I'm consuming this function, there's no way for me to predict what values might be coming out of this method. And so I won't know what statuses I have to handle unless I either have access to the source code or I decompile it, or if I'm super lucky, you've documented it and you've actually kept your documentation up to date, which is not, sadly, very common. So I prefer to do something that documents itself in code, and so I'm going to switch this to return an enum. And obviously, you wouldn't normally put the enum right here, but I'm going to put it here for now because we're just demoing. And just to be super clear, I'm just going to call it the method name plus result. So the first result I like to make is sort of the default one, which is basically the success one. Okay. And I explicitly set what I want the default one to be 0, so that if you just, if in your code you just do this, this will be okay. It sort of forces a predictable default. Now, I think the compiler will actually just pick the first one and make that the default, but I like to be explicit. So I'm going to change this up. So it's now returning a status code. And so instead of that string, we're going to say page is not published and generate that. Boom. And I'm going to leave this comment here because I'm going to come back to this in a second. Normally, I don't like to leave this kind of stuff commented. Okay. The next one, user, I guess, does not have access. It's kind of wordy, but it's clear. It's clear what's happening. And then the last one, we've already covered that case, the default case, which is okay. Nice work. So I think we've cleaned this method up quite a bit. This looks pretty good. We got to fix this one though. So it's still returning a string. It's still got these old nasty things. So what we can do is call our new method. User comment page. Now, sort of the dumb thing to do here would be to return result.toString. That actually breaks backwards compatibility though, because someone might be specifically looking for page is not published. Now it's going to return it as all smashed together with no spaces. So we need to be a little bit smarter about that. And really, there's probably like a compatibility layer. I could probably do a switch statement in a static method somewhere so that, if I need to do this somewhere else, it'll be available. But I'm just going to do it right here for right now because this is, as far as I know, the only place where this happens. And so we just add cases for all the different possibilities. So page is not published, returned this string before. I'm going to move that. And I want to just be sure that I get it exactly the same as it used to be. And that's why I left these commented. So user does not have access. There we go. Now the compiler's still complaining because technically it is possible to have an enum that doesn't match any of this and it will fall through. One of the things I think that C# is really missing is exhaustive pattern matching on enums, so that like the compiler could look at this enum and know that I've handled every possible case and be okay with this, or like give me a warning if I haven't handled every possible case. I know that's not possible because of how enums work in the back end, and I know there's a lot of complications with that, but it's like that's an F# feature that I sorely miss in C#. I do the next best thing, which is I create a default, and unfortunately this is the only thing I can do, is add a not implemented exception. I suppose I need to throw a new not implemented exception. And I just like to be explicit again. Oops. I guess I can just do result. There we go. So now at the very least, we'll find out that I forgot to handle a case at runtime, or if for some reason we add a new case and I don't, find all references to this and see where I'm doing the switch statement, I'll find it eventually, hopefully. And then the final thing to do here is it's obsolete, and we need to tell them, don't use this method, use another method, and we should just tell them what that method is. Use instead, please. Thanks. There. I mean, it's good to be polite. So there we have it. We reworked the code quite a bit. One of the things I like that we've done is we've reduced the amount of scrolling to the right that we originally had to do. Now it's a little more scrolling down, but I think it's more clear. I'm a big fan of code that just basically stops doing stuff when it doesn't need to keep doing stuff. So, if the page isn't published, I'm just going to stop. We don't need to keep reading this method if that's the case. If the user's not an admin, I have a bug here. I hope you all caught that. If the page is not currently used by or owned by the current user, they don't have access. We just bail out at this point. We don't have to keep thinking about it. Otherwise, we add the comment, and then we use the correct publish method depending on, whatever. And it's weird to me that this one accepts the current user and this one doesn't, but I didn't write this API. Actually, I did. But it's not a real API. So, this is just an example of some of the weirdness you sometimes have to deal with. But anyway, if they have access, the page is published, and then we just return the OK result. All right, I think that looks good. This is basically all the changes that I think I would make. I'm sure you're looking at this code at home, shaking your head, maybe crying, thinking, like, why would he do that? This is so awful. Like, it's terrible. I get it. It's not, everyone has their opinions. This is just how I would do it, and I just want to talk through my thought process as I do this refactoring. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it useful. See ya.